guys, and welcome to another episode of Funeral Facts. My name is Victoria. I am a licensed funeral director and embalmer, and I am here to share with you the facts about funeral service, both in modern times and throughout history. So today we are going to be talking about cremation. Cremation is a mode of final disposition that has increased in popularity over the last few years, becoming a little bit more popular nowadays than a traditional burial service. Cremation uses combustion or burning of a body to reduce it to what we know as ashes. In reality, the ashes are actually made up of inorganic bone fragments, and they're not technically ash. Cremation takes place at a crematory inside of cremation retort. The retort uses flames that burn up to about 1800 degrees Fahrenheit to burn away all of the organic materials of the body. So a typical cremation can take up to maybe 3 hours, but it depends on the weight of the body, so it could be shorter, it could be longer, depending on how much the person actually weighs. And then after the cremation, the remains are taken out of the retort and put through something called a cremulator, which grinds the bone fragments into the powder form of ash that we're all familiar with. Cremation has been present in various cultures throughout history as far back as 17,000 years ago, based on the records that scientists and archaeologists have found. And it's definitely more accepted in certain cultures and more frowned upon in certain cultures. Up until the rise of Christianity, cremation was more accepted and more common in different cultures throughout Europe. And there are certain religions like Christianity, Catholicism, Judaism, Islam that completely prohibit the use of cremation because of their belief in resurrection after death. Actually, in the Middle Ages, Christians would use cremation as a form of punishment for those who were deemed to be heretics. As we move throughout history, in the early 1900s, certain Protestant churches began to be more accepting of cremation as a form of disposition, but it wasn't until the 1960s when the Catholic Church would accept cremation. The only condition for that was that the remains had to be interred in a cemetery, not scattered or kept or anything like that. The main reason that cremation has gained so much popularity in modern times is primarily cost related. Cremation is a cheaper option than a traditional burial service. Even if you have more traditional services with the cremation, it does keep the cost relatively low. There are people that choose to have just a cremation with no services prior or after the cremation process. That is what we would call a direct cremation, where it is just a cremation, nothing more, nothing less, just that. You can, however, have more traditional services associated with a cremation. For example, you can still have an open casket visitation for 3 to 4 hours or however long you wanted to, and have a funeral service either in the funeral home or a mass at church or something like that, and then have the cremation afterwards, where you would normally have a burial in a cemetery. Instead, we would then take the person to the crematory and have them cremated. You can also do it where the person is cremated ahead of time, and the services would then be either a memorial visitation at the funeral home, or you could have a memorial mass or memorial service. And in that case, it would be either the urn present or a photo present instead of having a casket present. So a lot of people tend to think that if you have a cremation, you can't have any type of services with it, which isn't true. You can still have as traditional or non-traditional service as you'd like to, but just have a cremation instead of a burial. So at the crematory, only one cremation can take place inside one retort at a time. So most crematories have multiple retorts so that they do have the ability to cremate more than one person at a time in the single retorts. And reputable crematories have plenty of security measures for identification purposes so that they always know who is in what retort at what time. They have special ID tags that are put on the outside of the retort that are kept with the person throughout the entire process. So there really is little to no risk of getting the remains mixed up with somebody else. A lot of people express concern over that, and it really doesn't happen. I mean, I'm sure that unfortunately it has happened to some crematories in the past, but it's never happened in the crematory that my firm uses. I've never heard of it happening to any of my friends and colleagues. So for reassurance purposes, they do have these measures in place so that that does not happen. The crematory will also usually require the person to be placed into some sort of container for the cremation process. Now, this can be a casket, a wooden casket. Most crematories, especially the ones that I've talked to, won't cremate a metal casket. There are certain situations where they will, but it's very rare that they would do that because it requires the temperature to be a lot higher and it burns a lot slower. So most of the time, it would have to be a wooden casket. If a casket is not used, we would use something that we would call an alternative container, which is basically made up of a plywood base with a fiberboard or cardboard top to go on it. And this serves basically two purposes, really. It's to protect the integrity and the dignity of the person being cremated, and it's also to make it easier for the crematory operators to slide the person into the retort quickly so that not a lot of heat escapes out of the retort. There are some religions like Hinduism that require the cremation process to be witnessed. So a crematory will be aware of this and will allow the family to do any of the rituals that they would normally do, and they're allowed to witness the person being placed into the retort for the cremation process to begin. This stems from those religious sects. In the olden days, they would build a funeral pyre and they would have an open air cremation of their loved one. So in order to keep up with those traditions that they normally would have, they are allowed to go to the crematory and have any rituals that they would have and then witness the cremation. When we get the cremated remains back from the crematory, they're usually in what's called a temporary container, which is basically a black plastic box. Now, it's up to the family whether they want to get an urn or not, and that usually depends on what they plan on doing with the cremated remains once they have them back in their care. If they want to keep them, or bury them, or scatter them, etc., they may opt to stick with the temporary container, or they might opt to purchase a nicer urn. Urns can be made of wood or brass or marble. Sometimes you can get your loved one's name and dates engraved on the front of it, or get a plate with those things on it to stick on the front of the urn. But really it all depends on what the person plans on doing with their loved one, whether or not they decide to purchase an urn or not. It's not required, it's just something that some people opt to do. A lot of families express concern if their loved one has a type of metal implant in their body, say a plate or screws or rods or a fake hip or a fake knee, titanium things, joints, whatever. Those are perfectly fine to go into the crematory retort. They will be sifted out after the cremation has been completed and discarded. The only things that we worry about and that we have to actually remove from a person before they're cremated would be things like pacemakers that contain mercury, or radioactive things that could potentially explode inside of the retort and cause damages. So every time a person does have a pacemaker, we of course ask for permission from the family can we please remove this because it is a hazard to the crematory. So that does have to be done. But anything else, you know, dental fillings, things like jewelry, of course we always tend to recommend that jewelry be taken off of the person before the cremation is done, but we can cremate a person with jewelry on, and like I said, it's just taken out at the end. If there's any bits left over, it's just taken out and discarded at the end. So one thing that's important to know is that cremation is a mode of disposition. It is not a method of final disposition. A lot of people tend to think that once a person is cremated, that's it, you don't have to do anything else. You actually do, because even though the person is reduced to cremated remains, you know, it's only about, I don't know, 5 pounds, give or take, of cremated remains that are left of a person after the process, you still need to understand that that's still a person. Even though they're taken on a new form, it's still a human being and it's still your loved one. So methods of disposition for cremated remains would be either keeping them at home or burying them in a cemetery, putting them inside of a niche in a columbarium, which is basically like a mausoleum for cremated remains, or scattering them. And those are the most common things to do. You can scatter them on land, you can scatter them at sea, or any of the other things that I mentioned. Those are usually the most common things. There are other less common things that you can do with cremated remains. For example, you could have them made into blown glass. You can have them made into diamonds for jewelry. You can have them shot into space. There is certain companies that will shoot cremated remains into space, and they'll orbit the Earth for a year or two, I think. You can also incorporate them into an artificial reef, which is where they take the cremated remains and they mix them in with cement and they make these artificial reefs, and they have designated spots where they drop them down and it becomes basically an ecosystem for the marine wildlife. You can also incorporate the cremated remains into paint or into ink for tattoos. I don't recommend doing that personally, but it has been done and it can be done. Depends on if you go to like certain tattoo artists. Some of them may say yes, some of them may say no. But personally, after talking to my own tattoo artist, I wouldn't recommend it. But you're free to do, of course, whatever you want to do with your loved one. Now, some people have reservations about cremation because of the environmental impact. It does produce carbon emissions. So is it the best thing in the world for the environment? Probably not. But is it a, you know, terrible thing that needs to be stopped because we're ruining the environment? No. There is a greener alternative to cremation. It's called alkaline hydrolysis or Aquamation. So what that entails is the person is placed into a pressurized vessel, and there is a mixture of water and potassium hydroxide that's heated to about 320 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's a lot of pressure involved so that there's no boiling. So basically the body is liquefied instead of burnt. And at the end of the process, what you're left with is calcium phosphate bone fragments, which are then ground up like regular cremated remains and given to the family as ashes. This process, though, is only legal in 18 states currently. There are other states that have pending things going on, whether they're going to legalize aquamation for people. I know that it is available for pets more than it is for human beings currently. So you can, in certain places, have your pets undergo aquamation if you want to. But another thing that's very important is to remember that there's no right or wrong when it comes to choosing what kind of disposition you would like for either yourself or your loved one would like for themselves or anything like that. There's no right or wrong. It's really the wishes of the person that is in need of our services that we take into consideration. And if you're not sure, maybe discussing the options with your family might be a good idea to figure out whether you would like to do cremation or a burial or an entombment or anything of the sort. But no matter what, we're always going to respect your wishes at the funeral home no matter what you choose. So you can always remember that we will, of course, treat everyone with the same respect and dignity as we treat everyone else. So that's all the facts on cremation that I have for you guys today. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment below if you would like to ask me to do a video on anything in particular. Make sure to follow me on my socials. They'll also be linked below. And have a great rest of your day. Respect your dead. Hug your funeral directors when you see them, if you can. Hopefully we can hug soon enough. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye!